The alien Batwoman spread her wings and declared I was hers before the clan. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The landing was a controlled crash, a brutal testament to the fury of atmosphere. Alex Vance felt the impact resonate through his bones, the transport shuttle groaning in protest as powerful inertial dampeners fought a losing battle against the planet's savage gravity and shearing winds. Outside the reinforced plasteel viewport, a perpetual twilight reigned, a bruised purple sky torn by jagged forks of silver lightning that illuminated a hellscape of needle-like mountain peaks. His mission briefing had called the world storm-racked, a sterile, insufficient term for the raw, untamed violence on display. This was a world that actively tried to kill anything that touched it, and its inhabitants, had evolved to match its ferocity. Alex smoothed the front of his sleek black diplomatic suit, a garment that felt absurdly flimsy and out of place in this primal setting, and focused on his breathing. He was here to secure the treaty for ore, a material with unique properties vital to the Terran Alliance's fleet, and his nervousness was a luxury he could not afford, even as his stomach churned with a mixture of high-gravity nausea and pure, unadulterated apprehension. The shuttle's ramp hissed open, unleashing a blast of ozone-scented, chillingly thin air that whipped at his clothes and hair, and he stepped out onto a wide, wind-swept precipice of glistening black rock, the maw of a colossal fortress carved directly into the mountainside looming before him. Torches, burning with an unnatural greenish-white flame, blazed in high alcoves, their light flickering across the imposing figures of the honor guard assembled to meet him, their immense, winged silhouettes making them look like demons from some forgotten mythology. The two guards who flanked him were silent sentinels, each easily a head and a half taller than his own 6 feet, their skin a deep, rich indigo that seemed to drink the flickering torchlight. Muscles coiled like thick cables under their skin, and massive, leathery wings, the texture of ancient parchment, were folded tightly against their powerful backs. They didn't speak as they escorted him, their heavy footfalls echoing in the cavernous corridors of the fortress, their presence a constant, oppressive weight. Alex kept his posture straight and his gaze forward, his mind racing through cultural protocols and negotiation strategies, a desperate attempt to build a mental fortress against the intimidating reality of his surroundings. The air inside was thick with the smells of strange, roasting meat, damp stone, and the sharp, metallic tang of the people themselves. The fortress was not a place of refined architecture. It was a testament to raw power, with walls smoothed by of wind and hands, not by tools, and the ceiling so high it was lost in shadow above the reach of the torchlight. They finally entered the great hall, a vast, circular chamber teeming with warriors. A great, roaring fire pit dominated the center of the room, sending sparks and smoke swirling up towards the unseen ceiling. Hundreds of ruby-red eyes turned to watch him as he walked, a single, pale, fragile-looking creature in a sea of indigo giants. He felt 1,000 years of predatory instinct assessing him, judging his worth, and his diplomatic smile felt like a brittle mask. At the far end of the hall, on a throne of carved rock and alien furs, sat the matriarch, an ancient whose wings were and torn, her face a roadmap of countless battles and harsh seasons. Her eyes, however, were as sharp and clear as polished gems, and they missed nothing. She was the ultimate authority, but Alex knew from his briefings that she rarely involved herself in the minutiae of diplomacy, preferring to delegate to her chosen champion, her niece. "You are the Terran Alex Vance," the matriarch's voice boomed, a low, resonant sound that was less a question and more a statement of fact, her words in the shared trade language carrying a heavy, guttural accent. He inclined his head in a gesture of respect he hoped was correctly executed. "I am, honored matriarch. I bring greetings from the Terran Alliance and a proposal for a partnership that will benefit both our peoples." His voice was steady, a product of years of training to betray no weakness, even when his heart was hammering against his ribs. The matriarch made a slight gesture with one long-fingered hand. "My niece will hear your proposal. She speaks for the clan in this matter." From the shadows beside the throne, a figure emerged, and the ambient rumble of the hall seemed to quiet in her presence. Was even taller than the guards, a breathtaking 7.5 feet of sculpted muscle and graceful power. Her indigo skin was flawless, her bob-cut black hair a stark, severe frame for a face of stunning, predatory beauty. But it was her eyes that captured him. They were the color of the deepest rubies, and they didn't just look at him. They seemed to glow with their own internal fire as they dissected him piece by piece. She moved with a liquid grace that belied her size, her curvy bust and hips hinting at a fierce femininity that was in no way soft. She stopped a respectful distance from the matriarch but positioned herself so she was looking down on Alex, a subtle but clear assertion of dominance. "The Terran Alliance wants our ore," stated, her voice a smooth, dangerous contralto. "You have traveled far. Do not waste our time with pleasantries. State your offer." The negotiations that followed were a grueling affair, a verbal battle of wits and wills. Alex, despite his initial intimidation, found his rhythm, his mind sharpening to a fine edge. He was a diplomat, and this was his arena, even if the stakes felt impossibly high. He had probing questions about Terran military strength, countered her lowball resource valuations with impeccable logic, and presented the alliance's offer not as a plea, but as a mutually beneficial transaction between equals. He could feel her grudging respect growing with every exchange, a subtle softening of her imperious posture, a flicker of something other than disdain in those glowing ruby eyes. He noted her chief rival, a hulking, brutish-looking male named, watching their exchange from a few paces away, his face a mask of scowling impatience, his presence a constant, simmering threat at the edge of the proceedings. Alex knew he needed to build a bridge, to make a gesture that went beyond the cold calculus of the treaty, something to show he respected their culture, not just their resources. He decided the time was right. "Champion," Alex said, his voice ringing with practiced sincerity as he paused the discussion of shipping logistics. "The Terran Alliance understands that the people are warriors, a culture of strength and honor. To simply offer currency or technology feels insufficient. As a sign of our deep respect for your traditions, I wish to present you with a personal gift." He signaled to his aide, who brought forward a long, polished wooden case. A ripple of interest went through the assembled clan. Alex opened the case to reveal a Terran ceremonial blade, a masterpiece of metallurgical art. Its hilt was wrapped in synth leather, its was elegantly curved silver, and the blade itself was forged from a shimmering alloy that seemed to capture and refract the torchlight. It was a beautiful, deadly object, meant to honor the warrior spirit he had been told held so dear. Holding it carefully, he approached and extended it to her, hilt first, in what he believed was the universal gesture of offering a weapon in peace. "A gift to honor the clan's foremost champion," he declared, his voice resonating with what he hoped was appropriate solemnity. The reaction was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The low, murmuring hum of the great hall did not just quiet, it vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it was a physical pressure against his eardrums. Every single warrior was frozen, their ruby eyes wide, staring not at the blade but at him. His face had become a mask of stone, her pupils contracting to pinpricks, her full lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. A cold dread, colder than the wind, washed over Alex. He knew with absolute certainty that he had just made a catastrophic, universe-shattering mistake. He just didn't know what it was. The suffocating silence was broken by a single explosive sound, a short, sharp bark of laughter. It came from who threw his head back and let out a booming, mocking roar that echoed through the vast chamber. Other warriors, followers of his faction, joined in, their derision a wave of sound that crashed over the diplomatic proceedings. "Well, well, niece," bellowed, his voice dripping with condescending amusement as he took a swaggering step forward, his eyes fixed on its rigid form. "I knew the offer soft, but I never imagined one would be so bold. To come all this way, a wingless, soft-skinned little mammal, and make you a marriage proposal in front of the entire clan." Marriage proposal. The words hit Alex like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. His mind scrambled, frantically replaying the dozens of cultural briefing files he had memorized. He saw it then, a single, obscure footnote in a dense anthropological text. Among the clans, the gifting of a blade from a male to an unmarried female warrior is the most direct and binding form of marital contract proposal. It is a public declaration of intent. He had not offered a symbol of respect. He had, according to their ancient customs, just asked the most formidable warrior on the planet to be his wife. Was circling them now like a predator, savoring his rival's public humiliation. "What will you do?" he taunted, his voice loud enough for every warrior to hear. "Will you accept this tiny creature as your mate? His wingspan is rather lacking. Or will you reject him and insult his entire alliance, proving you are too weak to secure this treaty for us?" Was trapped, backed into a political corner with no easy escape. To reject the proposal now, after it had been publicly declared as such, would be to show weakness, to buckle under taunts and appear indecisive. It would shatter her authority and likely cost her the right to conclude the treaty. But to accept a human, a creature viewed as impossibly fragile and alien, was unthinkable, a humiliation of a different kind that would exploit for years to come. Her jaw was clenched so tightly that Alex could see the muscles twitching in her indigo cheeks, her knuckles white where her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. Her magnificent wings were pressed so tightly to her back they looked as if they might shatter the stone behind her. And as Alex stood there, the beautiful, terrible blade still extended in his hand, the full weight of his blunder settled upon him, a crushing pressure that threatened to buckle his knees. He had not just jeopardized a vital treaty. He had publicly shamed a warrior champion and possibly ignited an interstellar incident, all while handing her greatest rival the perfect weapon to destroy her. The silence in the great hall was a living entity, a crushing weight that pressed down on Alex, sealing the moment of his failure in amber for every to witness. His mocking laughter was the hammer that shattered it, and the shards of sound were daggers of humiliation aimed squarely at. In that frozen eternity, Alex's mind, a finely tuned instrument of diplomacy and crisis management, went into overdrive, calculating the cascading consequences of his blunder. He saw the treaty collapsing, his career ending in disgrace, and a potential border skirmish igniting because he had misread a cultural footnote. He felt the phantom weight of his superior's condemnation, but it was a distant concern compared to the immediate, visceral threat emanating from the hundreds of giant, predatory beings surrounding him. His life was likely forfeit, but his training screamed at him to find a way out, to salvage something from the wreckage, yet his mind offered nothing. Every protocol, every contingency plan he had ever drilled, was designed for interactions between sane, rational species, not for a situation where he had accidentally proposed marriage to a 7.5-foot-tall warrior princess with a ceremonial knife. He could see the intricate dance of clan politics playing out on the faces around him, the cruel amusement on the faces of faction, the flicker of pity in the eyes of some of the older warriors, and the unreadable granite-like stoicism of the matriarch on her throne. But his focus was locked on, who stood perfectly still, absorbing the full force of derision and the clan's scrutiny, her posture a study in absolute, rigid control. He saw the minute, almost imperceptible tremor at the very tip of her left wing, the only sign of the tectonic pressures building within her. She was a living statue of contained fury, and he was the fool who had chained her to the pedestal. Reveling in his moment of triumph, took another swaggering step forward, his voice a venomous boom that filled the hall, deliberately pushing her towards the precipice. "What is it, niece? Has the little mammal tied your tongue? An offer has been made before the clan. You are honor-bound to answer. Will you have him, or will you prove you are too timid to even conduct simple diplomacy without making a mess of it?" He was giving her no room to maneuver, forcing her into a binary choice where either answer was a victory for him. It was a masterful, if brutish, political attack, and as Alex watched, he saw a flicker in its ruby eyes, a spark of something ancient and terrifying. She was a hunter who had just realized the trap she was in was not inescapable, but could, in fact, be turned upon the one who had set it. The decision, when it came, did not begin with a word but with a slow, deliberate intake of breath, a subtle expansion of her powerful chest. Then she moved. It was a single, fluid step that brought her directly in front of Alex, placing herself between him and then, with a sound like tearing leather and rushing wind, she unfurled her wings. It was a gesture of such breathtaking power and scale that it stole the air from the hall. The massive, leathery appendages spread to their full, magnificent span, wider than any three warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking the light from a dozen torches, and casting a vast, intimidating shadow that engulfed not only Alex but the very ground on which stood. The hall, which had been filled with jeers and whispers, fell utterly silent once more, this time in awe and fear of the raw dominance on display. She tilted her head, her glowing ruby eyes locking onto her rivals, and the look in them was not of a cornered politician, but of a queen about to pass judgment. When she finally spoke, her voice was not a shout, but a low, dangerous purr that cut through the silence with chilling precision, each word a carefully shaped weapon. "You mistake courage for courtship. Only a fool like you would see a proposal where I see an offering of submission." A collective gasp went through the crowd as she completely reframed the situation. She turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over Alex, who stood frozen within the cage of her wings, the ceremonial blade still held uselessly in his hands. Her eyes were dismissive, yet analytical, as if she were examining a curious insect. "This human has the nerve of a hunter crossing the void to stand in our hall. He does not come to offer himself as a mate." She let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of humor and full of contempt. "Look at him. He is small, wingless, and soft. A pitiful choice for a consort. His offering," she said, gesturing to the blade with a flick of her eyes, "is not a bride price. It is a trinket, a toy. It is the desperate plea of a lesser creature seeking the protection of a superior power." With a movement too fast to follow, her hand shot out and clamped around Alex's upper arm. Her grip was like forged steel, impossibly strong and radiating an intense heat that soaked through the fabric of his suit. She effortlessly pulled him from his spot, swinging him around to her side and tucking him against her body as if he weighed nothing at all. He stumbled, his balance gone, his entire world suddenly reduced to the scent of ozone and warm indigo skin, and the terrifying, unyielding strength of her hold. She held him there, a clear and public demonstration of physical ownership, before turning her fiery gaze back to the stunned clan. "I find his audacity amusing," she declared, her voice rising in volume, resonating with power. "He is a curious pet, and his loyalty," she paused, letting the words hang in the air, "belongs to me now." Her final proclamation was a roar, a raw primal sound that vibrated in Alex's very bones as she held him fast. "I claim him. He is mine." The proclamation echoed in the sudden, shocked stillness of the great hall. She had not accepted a marriage proposal. She had claimed property. She had taken a carefully constructed political trap and transformed it into a throne of her own making, turning a moment of extreme vulnerability into an unparalleled display of personal power and cunning. The culture, Alex's mind supplied with a detached, horrified clarity, had ancient and unbreakable laws regarding personal claims. A warrior's claimed property, be it a weapon, a territory, or a living creature, was untouchable. To interfere with it was to issue a direct, mortal challenge to the owner. Was left standing in the shadow of her wings, his face a contorted mask of pure, undiluted fury. He had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. He could not challenge her claim on such a meager thing as a human pet without looking petty and ridiculous, his challenge unworthy of a true warrior. His every possible move had been countered, his attack not only blocked but turned back on him with devastating force. A low murmur rippled through the assembled warriors, a sound of grudging, deep respect for the sheer audacity and brilliance of their champion's move. Even the matriarch from her throne gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of approval. Without releasing her iron grip on Alex's arm, let her wings slowly fold back into a resting position, the oppressive shadow receding. She then turned her attention back to the matriarch, her voice returning to its cool, businesslike tone as if the entire life-altering event had been a minor, irrelevant interruption. "Honored matriarch," she said calmly, "as the Terran's loyalties are now assured, we may proceed with the treaty negotiations. I believe we were discussing the transport and refinement quotas for the first 5 solar cycles." She was in complete control, the master of the hall, the hero of the moment. And Alex Vance, diplomat of the Terran Alliance, was trapped, a pawn who had been unexpectedly promoted to a strategic piece in a game he was only beginning to comprehend. He was a diplomatic envoy who had somehow become a spoil of war, a living symbol of political victory, and most terrifyingly of all, her possession. His mission was, against all odds, still viable, but his life, his freedom, and his dignity were now held entirely in the grip of the magnificent, terrifying alien Batwoman, who had just declared he was hers before the entire clan. The conclusion of the formal proceedings was a blur to Alex, a series of booming pronouncements that he barely registered as, her grip still a manacle of warm, unyielding flesh on his arm, navigated him away from the center of the Great Hall. He moved because he was being moved, a puppet on a string he never saw coming, acutely aware of the hundreds of pairs of ruby eyes that followed his every step. He was a curiosity, a trophy, a scandal, and the weight of their collective gaze was a physical force. He could feel stare like a spear point in his back, burning with a furious, thwarted hatred that promised future conflict. The journey through the fortress's winding, torchlit corridors was a silent parade of his own humiliation, with as the stoic, unreadable Grand Marshal. Warriors would press themselves flat against the stone walls as she passed, a gesture of profound respect for her, their eyes flicking down to him with a mixture of contempt and bewilderment. He had gone from being a respected foreign envoy to something akin to a prize hound being led on a leash, and the transition had been so swift and total that his mind was still struggling to catch up. They finally stopped before a massive, iron-banded stone door, which opened with a single, effortless push. She pulled him inside, and the door swung shut behind them with a deep, resonant boom that echoed with the finality of a tomb being sealed. For a long moment, the only sound in the chamber was their breathing, and in that sudden, profound isolation, the oppressive weight of the public spectacle was replaced by a new, far more personal and volatile tension. The instant the door sealed them in, the regal champion from the Great Hall vanished, released his arm, not gently, but with a sharp shove that sent him stumbling back a few steps. The carefully controlled mask of command she had worn in public crumbled, replaced by a raw, unvarnished fury that seemed to radiate from her in waves. She didn't look at him, but began to pace the length of the chamber, a caged predator in her own den, her massive wings twitching with agitation, brushing against the stone walls with a dry, rasping sound. Her chambers were as severe and practical as she was, a Spartan space dominated by a large stone table covered in what looked like strategic maps, a rack of wicked-looking polearms against one wall, and a sleeping area consisting of a thick pile of dark, alien furs. This was not a room for comfort, but a command center for a warrior. "You fool," she finally hissed, the words a low, venomous growl as she whirled to face him, her ruby eyes blazing with a fire that made the torches in the hall seem pale. "You witless, blundering off. Do you have any conception of what you almost did? Of the fire you almost brought down on all of our heads?" She advanced on him, and he had to fight the instinct to retreat, his diplomatic training the only thing keeping his feet planted to the stone floor. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, but she cut him off with a sharp, angry gesture. "Your apologies are worthless. I need you to understand the damage you have done, and the position you have now put us both in." She gestured angrily at the map table. "Does not want this treaty. His faction believes any alliance with outsiders is a contamination, a weakening of the bloodline. He sees me as a progressive, a radical who would trade our heritage for Terran technology. He has been looking for a way to discredit me for seasons. And you," she said, stabbing a finger in his direction, handed him the perfect blade. She explained, her words clipped and furious, that his proposal had been a gift to her rival. A public confirmation of everything had been whispering in the shadows. That was too soft, too easily swayed by outsiders, that she was unfit to lead. This challenge had been designed to force her to either refuse the treaty by insulting its envoy, or accept a human mate and become a laughingstock, in either case, ceding all power and influence to him. Alex listened, his mind absorbing the information and rapidly recalibrating his understanding of the situation. His blunder had not been a simple social gaffe. It had been a spark thrown into a powder keg of clan politics. He was a pawn in a brutal power struggle he hadn't even known existed. "So your claim," he stated, his voice quiet but steady as he connected the pieces, "was not an act of anger. It was a political countermove." Stopped her packing, a flicker of surprise in her eyes at his quick comprehension. "Of course it was," she snapped, though with slightly less venom. "It was the only move I had left. The clan law of personal claim is ancient and absolute. By declaring you my property, I made you an extension of my own honor. Cannot touch you without challenging me directly, a challenge he has now lost the political capital to make. I turned your idiotic act of submission into a symbol of my strength. I saved your life, and I saved my own authority, and with it, the treaty you were sent here to secure." She sank onto a stone bench, the immense energy of her rage finally seeming to ebb, replaced by a profound weariness. For the first time, Alex saw the immense weight she carried, the constant pressure of leadership in a culture that preyed on any sign of weakness. She was not just a fierce warrior. She was a politician fighting for the future of her people against a tide of violent tradition. "So now we are bound together by this lie," she said, rubbing her temples with one long-fingered hand. "And it must be a convincing lie. Terran will be watching. His followers will be watching. They will look for any crack in our story, any sign that you are not what I have claimed you to be. You will have a role to play in this charade, and you will play it perfectly." This was the moment Alex's mind finally shifted from damage control to active strategy. He was no longer just the cause of the problem. He was an integral part of the solution. Saw him as a piece to be moved on a board, but he knew he had to be a player or he would be sacrificed. "I understand," he said, taking a careful step forward, his tone shifting from apologetic to collaborative. "In public, I am yours. I will be deferential, attentive, whatever the role requires. I will not fail you in this." Looked up, a hint of suspicion in her eyes. "See that you don't. Your life depends on it." He held her gaze, refusing to be cowed. "And so does yours, which is why this arrangement needs to be more than just you giving orders and me blindly following them. In public, I am your property. But in private," he continued, pressing his advantage as he saw her begin to listen, "we must be partners, allies. I cannot play the part of a devoted consort convincingly if I am ignorant. I don't know your customs, your traditions, the 100 subtle ways I could betray our lie with a single wrong gesture. I am a diplomat champion. My skills are observation, adaptation, and persuasion. But a diplomat without information is useless. If we are to survive this, you need to arm me. You need to teach me." He saw the logic of his argument dawn on her face, battling with her warrior's instinct to command and control. He was offering her the use of his mind as a weapon, an asset she had previously dismissed. He was not asking for freedom, but for the tools to perform his function within their new, shared prison. It was a negotiation, and even in this impossibly compromised position, he felt a spark of his old self return. Was silent for a long time, her ruby eyes studying him with a new, intense scrutiny, reassessing the man she had dismissed as a soft-skinned fool. She had seen his blunder in the Great Hall, but she had also seen his courage in not flinching from her rage. Now she was seeing his mind at work, his ability to analyze a desperate situation and find a path forward. She was a pragmatist above all else, and she recognized the truth in his words. A poorly played part would be as dangerous as open rebellion. Finally, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Your logic is sound, Alex Vance," she conceded, the use of his name a small but significant shift in their dynamic. "The risk of your ignorance is too great. Very well. In this room and this room alone, we are allies. I will teach you what you need to know. I will tell you who to watch, what to say, and how to act. You will be my eyes and ears in places I cannot be, and you will report everything to me. You will be my weapon, and I will aim you." She rose to her full, intimidating height, her weariness replaced by a renewed sense of grim purpose. "But you must understand this. The moment we step outside this door, you are mine. Your will is my will. Your life is in my hands. There will be no mistakes and no second chances." Alex nodded, accepting the harsh terms of their new reality. "Understood." They stood in the quiet of her Spartan chambers, the air thick with the unspoken tension of their pact. They were not friends, not lovers, not even captor and captive anymore. They were two unwilling conspirators, a winged champion and a human diplomat bound together by a desperate lie, their survival now inextricably linked. The great storm of politics raged outside, and they were in the eye of it, alone, with only each other's wits and a fragile, newly forged alliance to see them through. The days following their tense pact settled into a strange and demanding rhythm, a life of carefully constructed dual realities. In the Spartan privacy of her chambers was a relentless and exacting teacher, drilling Alex on the intricate genealogies of the clans, the subtle body language of dominance and submission, and the pantheon of warrior gods whose names were invoked in every oath. He was a quick study, his diplomatic mind soaking up the cultural data like a dry sponge, and she began to treat his insights with a grudging respect. But the moment they stepped outside her door, the alliance vanished and the charade began. He became her shadow, his posture deferential, his gaze attentive, always walking a half step behind her, a convincing performance of the devoted consort. Their public appearances became a calculated theatrical production, and it was during one such necessary performance that their fragile conspiracy was put to the test. A traditional cliffside hunt was announced, a semi-annual ritual to honor the sky goddess, and participation as clan champion was mandatory. Her claimed off, therefore, was expected to attend as well, a prospect that filled Alex with a profound sense of dread. He was not built for scaling treacherous mountain ledges in pursuit of winged, carnivorous beasts, but to refuse would be a fatal crack in their facade. So he found himself clad in borrowed leathers that felt stiff and foreign, standing on a narrow precipice with a 1,000-foot drop just inches from his heel, the savage winds of threatening to peel him from the rock face. And his followers were there, their presence a palpable poison in the thin mountain air, their taunts about the wingless pet, barely veiled as they swooped and soared on the updrafts with predatory grace, their every movement a reminder of Alex's terrestrial helplessness. Stayed close to him, her instructions on where to place his hands and feet clipped and precise, her body a constant, solid shield against the worst of the wind, her focus divided between the hunt and his survival. The hunt was a terrifying spectacle of aerial acrobatics and brutal efficiency. The warriors would launch themselves from the cliffs, riding the complex wind currents with their powerful wings to dive upon their prey, creatures that resembled large reptilian bats. Was magnificent, a force of nature in her element, her movements a blur of indigo skin and dark, leathery wings against the bruised purple sky. Alex, for his part, focused solely on not becoming a liability, his attention locked on the shifting, treacherous scree under his boots. He was observing a narrow game trail on a higher ledge when he saw it, a subtle but unmistakable movement from two of his most vocal cronies. It was not the patient stillness of a hunter, but the furtive, coordinated action of saboteurs. As swooped down to make her kill on a ledge below Alex's position, the two warriors above them leaned against a precariously balanced rock outcropping. It was a perfectly timed and deniable act of violence. With a deep groan, the outcropping gave way, unleashing an avalanche of rock and debris directly down the cliff face towards its position. The world dissolved into a roaring chaos of sound and motion as the mountain seemed to come apart. Reacted with breathtaking speed, her kill forgotten as she half unfurled a wing to shield her head, her eyes scanning for an escape route. But she was pinned, the narrow ledge offering no room to maneuver, and her attention was focused on the main cascade of smaller rocks pelting down from above. She did not see the true danger, a single massive boulder, the size of a ground car that had been dislodged and was now tumbling end over end, on a direct trajectory to crush her from her blind side. Alex's mind had no time for thought, only for the primal, screaming instinct to act. With a desperate shout of her name, he launched himself forward, closing the dozen feet between them and slamming into her with the full force of his body, a pathetic amount of force compared to her own strength, but it was just enough. The impact shoved her sideways, making her stumble out of the boulder's direct path. She was saved, but his momentum carried him into the space she had just occupied. He saw a universe of grinding stone fill his vision, and then an explosion of white-hot agony erupted in his left shoulder as the edge of the boulder clipped him, spinning him around and slamming him hard against the cliff wall. The very ledge beneath their feet fractured and broke away, plunging them into the abyss, a fall that was only arrested by powerful arms wrapping around him as she beat her massive wings against the storm, fighting for purchase in the violent, debris-filled air. She found them shelter not a moment too soon, a shallow cave carved into the sheer cliff face by centuries of wind, just as the sky finally broke open. Storms were legendary, and this one descended with a primal fury, unleashing a torrential downpour that fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, punctuated by deafening cracks of thunder and blinding flashes of lightning that illuminated their precarious perch. Drenched and shivering, dragged him deeper into the cave, the adrenaline that had sustained him finally draining away, leaving in its place a nauseating, all-consuming sea of pain. His left arm was a useless, burning weight, and the world was beginning to tilt and swim at the edges. With a detached clinical grimness, tore a strip of leather from his borrowed tunic and began examining the injury, her touch surprisingly gentle for all its strength. Her face was a mask of concentration, but he could see a new, unfamiliar emotion in her eyes as she confirmed his shoulder was not just broken, but dislocated, the joint pushed grotesquely out of place. "This will hurt," she stated, the words an absurd understatement. "Do not bite your tongue off." Before he could properly brace himself, she placed a foot against his ribs for leverage, gripped his arm, and with a single, brutal and expertly violent motion, she wrenched the joint back into its socket. A raw, ragged scream was torn from his throat, echoing uselessly against the roar of the storm, as a wave of blackness threatened to pull him under. He fought it, gritting his teeth, his body trembling with the aftershocks of agony. It was in this delirious, pain-fogged state that he looked past her, out at the maelstrom, and a half-conscious, absurd thought bubbled up from his memory. "Well," he gasped, his voice thin and shaky, a hysterical giggle threatening to escape his lips, "it's really raining cats and dogs out there." Who had been focused on binding his arm to his chest, went still. She slowly turned her head and peered out into the deluge, her ruby eyes scanning the curtain of rain with a look of genuine, predatory confusion. "There are no animals," she said, turning back to him, her brow furrowed. "Only water." The utter, literal seriousness of her expression struck him as the most profound and ridiculous thing he had ever encountered. The absurdity of it, of this magnificent, terrifying warrior goddess searching for falling pets in a planetary tempest because of his stupid, meaningless idiom, broke through his wall of pain. A weak chuckle escaped him, then another, until he was shaking with pained, helpless laughter. For a moment, simply stared at him as if he had lost his mind, but then she saw the genuine, tear-streaked mirth in his eyes, and a strange, unfamiliar sound rumbled deep in her chest. It started as a low vibration and grew into a rich, throaty laugh, a sound as wild and unrestrained as the storm itself. It was the first time he had ever heard her laugh, and the sound was a more potent medicine than any painkiller, a moment of shared, insane levity in the heart of a hurricane on an alien world. The laughter eventually subsided, leaving a comfortable, breathless silence in its wake, a stark contrast to the howling chaos outside. The tension that had defined their every interaction, the rigid lines of their conspiracy, had been washed away by shared danger and dissolved by a moment of genuine amusement. Huddled together for warmth against the chilling damp, the atmosphere in the small cave had irrevocably shifted. His gaze fell to his crudely splinted arm, and then drifted to a long, silvery scar that traced a path along her own powerful forearm. "I was younger than you when I earned this," she said, her voice quiet, almost reflective, as she traced the scar with a fingertip. "During my ascension flight, the trial that marks a young as a true warrior, I was arrogant, so sure of my own strength. I flew too high, too fast, into the teeth of a storm much like this one." She told him of how the wind had shattered her wing, sending her plummeting from the sky, of the terror and the failure, and of how she had crashed into the razor-sharp rocks of the canyons below, lying broken and bleeding for nearly a full cycle before she was found. "That fall taught me a lesson my strength never could," she murmured, her eyes distant. "It taught me humility. It taught me that the sky does not reward arrogance, it punishes it. Every sees me as the champion, the unbreakable warrior. But I remember being the girl who fell." The confession hung in the air between them, a gift of vulnerability that was more precious than any treaty. Seeing this unexpected crack in her armor, Alex felt compelled to offer a piece of his own. "I became a diplomat because of a riot," he said softly, the memory surfacing with an odd clarity. "I was a junior on a colony world where two factions were ready to tear each other apart over water rights. I saw soldiers and barricades, but the one who stopped the violence was an old man, a negotiator who just listened. He listened for 3 days straight, until both sides had exhausted their anger and remembered they were neighbors. He showed me that a bridge built with words could be stronger than any fortress wall. I suppose," he finished with a small, self-deprecating smile, "we both learned that true strength isn't always about the force you can project." They sat in silence for a long time after that, the roar of the storm their only companion, but it was a silence that was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding, a connection forged not by political necessity, but by the sharing of scars, both visible and invisible. The unwilling allies, the warrior and the diplomat, had started to see the person behind the role, and in the heart of that savage storm, a fragile, tentative trust had finally begun to take root. Their return to the fortress was not the quiet, discreet affair Alex might have hoped for, but a public spectacle that the very narrative they had so desperately constructed. Half carrying and half supporting him, her own wing showing a slight, awkward tear from her fight against the storm, refused the aid of her honor guard and brought him through the main gates herself. The sight of their champion, battered but unbroken, supporting her injured off-consort sent a shockwave of speculation and rumor through the clan. The story of the hunt spread like wildfire, embellished with every telling, the tale of his cronies and the convenient rockslide, of the champion's perilous fall, and most importantly, of the wingless human who had thrown himself in the path of a tumbling boulder to save her. What had begun as a political lie was now taking on the unassailable weight of legend, a story of loyalty and shared sacrifice that resonated deeply with the warrior ethos. Standing soared to new heights, her bold claim now seen not as a strange whim but as a shrewd judgment of character, while found himself increasingly isolated, his failed and dishonorable gambit earning him the silent contempt of many of the clan's elders. The more the clan admired his bond with her strange but courageous pet, the more his own honor was diminished, his fury simmering into a volatile, dangerous poison that he was determined to unleash. Chose his moment with a demagogue's cunning, waiting for the evening gathering in the great hall when the matriarch was presiding and the clan was assembled in force. He strode into the center of the hall, his voice a thunderous roar that silenced the assembled warriors, and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Alex, who were seated near the matriarch's throne. "How long will we suffer this contamination?" bellowed, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "How long will we watch the champion of the people dote on a soft-skinned outsider, a creature of dust and gravity, while our traditions wither?" He paced before the central fire pit, his shadow leaping and dancing on the stone walls, his voice ringing with the passion of a zealot. "She brings him to our sacred hunts, she shares her kills with him, She allows his weakness to become her weakness. This treaty she champions is not a pact of equals. It is a gateway for their frailties to infect our strength. I say she is no longer fit to be our champion. His words were a direct and undeniable challenge, a gauntlet thrown down in the most public way imaginable. Before could even rise to respond, he turned to the matriarch, his posture shifting to one of profound, if theatrical, reverence. "Honored matriarch," he declared, his voice dropping to a grave and solemn tone, "I see the rot that this oaf has introduced into our clan, and I will not stand by and watch it fester. I invoke the trial of ascension." A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the hall. The trial of ascension was not a common duel. It was the most sacred and brutal of their rites, a mechanism reserved for the most dire challenges to leadership, a tradition so ancient and deadly it had not been invoked in 3 generations. It was a formal, binding contest to prove a warrior's worthiness, not just to hold a title, but to lead the very soul of the clan. The stakes laid out were absolute, leaving no room for negotiation or compromise, his ambition laid bare for all to see. "I will face her in the storm," he proclaimed, his gaze locking with a promise of violence passing between them. "We will be tested in strength in the sky and in combat as our ancestors were. When I am victorious," he said, the word when a statement of supreme and arrogant confidence, "I will claim what is rightfully mine by strength and tradition. I will take her territory and command of her warriors. I will assume control of these treaty negotiations and ensure that the people are not sold for trinkets and baubles by a champion with a divided heart." He paused, letting the weight of his claim settle over the silent assembly, before delivering his final, most personal blow. He turned his venomous gaze upon Alex, who sat beside, his arms still bound in a sling, a symbol of the very incident that had so enraged. "And I will claim her pet," he snarled, the word dripping with contempt. "I will take this human and put him to work in the ore mines where his weakness will be scoured from his bones. I will prove to the clan, once and for all, that strength is the only virtue, and that this alien affection is nothing but a disease." The threat was clear and deeply personal, aimed not just at its power, but at the very heart of the bond the clan now believed in. Rose slowly to her feet, her face a calm, cold mask of fury, her hand resting on the hilt of the blade she wore at her hip. The tension in the great hall was so thick it was almost impossible to breathe, as 2 of the clan's most powerful warriors stood on the brink of a conflict that could tear their people apart. All eyes turned to the ancient matriarch on her throne, the ultimate arbiter, whose decision would set the course for their future. The matriarch remained silent for a long time, her ancient, ruby eyes moving slowly between, and the silent, watching faces of her clan. She saw the dangerous schism was forcing, a division between the old ways and a new, uncertain future. To deny the trial would be to break with sacred tradition and make her appear weak, but to allow it was to risk the life of her champion and plunge the clan into a brutal, internecine conflict. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry rustle of old leaves, yet it carried an authority that commanded absolute attention. "The trial of ascension is a sacred rite," she pronounced, her words slow and deliberate. "It cannot be when invoked with cause, and the question of our clan's future is cause enough." A grim smile of triumph touched his lips, while a cold dread began to settle in Alex's stomach. The matriarch, however, had not finished. She raised a single, long-fingered hand, silencing some impending victory speech. "But the nature of the claim is unique," she continued, her gaze settling on Alex with an unnerving intensity. "The challenge is not merely over title and territory. It is over a claim of personal property, and that property is a sentient being from another star. Our ancient laws are clear on combat, but they are less clear when the spoils of that combat possess a will of their own." She let her words hang in the air, a subtle and complex legal argument that had every warrior leaning in to listen. An obscure codicil of the law of personal claim, from the time of the first matriarch, states that when a disputed claim involves an asset of undetermined nature or foreign origin, the asset itself must be part of the trial to prove its worthiness of being claimed. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. His triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a look of wary confusion. His impassive mask finally cracked, her eyes widening in dawning horror as she understood the implication of the matriarch's ruling. Therefore, the matriarch declared, her voice ringing with finality, the trial will proceed, but it will not be a trial of one warrior against another. It will be a trial of the claim itself. Champion will defend her position and her claim, and the subject of her claim, the off Alex Vance, must participate alongside her. The hall erupted in a cacophony of shocked and disbelieving shouts. His confusion instantly morphed into a look of savage, ecstatic joy. He threw his head back and laughed, a genuine, booming sound of pure triumph, for the matriarch had not just given him the trial he wanted. She had handed him the very instrument of his victory. Alex, the human diplomat with one good arm, was now a mandatory participant in a deadly warrior ritual. Stood frozen, her face pale, the full, catastrophic weight of the matriarch's ruling crashing down upon her. Victory, which would have been a difficult but achievable goal for her alone, now seemed utterly, terrifyingly impossible. She was shackled to an anchor and was waiting with malevolent glee to drag them both into the abyss. The boom of the great hall doors closing behind them did little to dispel the chilling finality of the matriarch's decree, and in the sudden, sharp silence of his chambers, the facade of the unbreakable champion finally shattered. For a moment, simply stood in the center of the room, her back to him, her powerful shoulders rigid with a tension that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Then, with a choked sound of pure despair, she slammed her fist against the solid stone of her map table, a crack spiderwebbing across the ancient surface under the force of the blow. She turned to face him, and the raw, unguarded horror in her ruby eyes struck Alex with more force than any physical impact. This was not the anger he had seen before, nor the weary frustration. This was the cold, stark terror of a commander who has just been ordered to lead her most valued soldier into a battle she knows cannot be won. "She has killed you, Alex," whispered, her voice rough with a pain that was entirely for him. "The matriarch has smiled and patted your head and handed you a death sentence. The trial of ascension is not a tournament. It is a ritual of blood and bone. It breaks warriors trained from birth. It will tear you apart." It was in this moment, seeing her profound despair for his sake, that Alex felt his own fear recede, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar calm. He was no longer the terrified diplomat caught in a web beyond his control. He was a partner in this catastrophe, and she needed him to be more than just a liability. "Then we cannot approach it like warriors," he said, his voice steady and even, a deliberate counterpoint to her anguish. He crossed the room to stand before her, ignoring the throbbing pain in his still healing shoulder, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are the greatest warrior in this clan, knows it. Everyone knows it. But he is not challenging just you, he is challenging us. If we try to fight him on his terms, with you trying to protect me while fighting him, we will lose. So we cannot fight on his terms. We have to change the nature of the fight itself." Her expression was one of bleak confusion, but the frantic edge of her terror began to subside, replaced by a flicker of curiosity at the sheer, unexpected resolve in his voice. "This isn't a battlefield you can win with words, Alex." "No," he agreed, his mind already beginning to dissect the problem, to break it down into variables and potential outcomes. "But every trial, every ritual has rules. It has stages. It has expectations." Is a traditionalist, a creature of brute force and predictable patterns. He sees a hammer and he sees me as a nail. That is his weakness. That is the battlefield where we will fight him. Their preparation for the trial became a grueling, all-consuming crucible that forged them into something new. The physical training was a brutal exercise in humility for Alex, as pushed him from before dawn until long after dusk. She taught him how to fall, how to roll with an impact, how to find his balance on treacherous, shifting rock, and how to stay conscious when pain and exhaustion screamed for surrender. He failed constantly, ending each day a collection of bruises and strained muscles, his human physiology a frustratingly fragile counterpoint to her effortless power. Yet, he never once refused a command, never once stayed down, and his dogged, stubborn refusal to quit began to earn him a quiet, grudging respect from the members of her personal guard who watched the sessions. They all knew he could never match her, but they saw in him a spirit that would not be broken, and that, to their warrior hearts, had a worth all its own. The true work, however, happened late at night in the flickering torchlight of chambers, hunched over the cracked strategy table. There, the roles were reversed. The warrior became the teacher, describing in minute detail the three traditional stages of the trial of ascension: the test of strength, a raw display of power; the sky race, a perilous flight through the narrow, storm-swept canyons of the highest peaks; and the final stage, combat on the pinnacle, a duel to submission or death. It was here, in the realm of strategy and information, that Alex came alive. He was no longer the clumsy pupil but the insightful analyst, his diplomat's mind probing for details had always taken for granted. He questioned the exact wording of the ancient oaths sworn before the trial, the geological instability of the canyons, the specific criteria by which a victor in each stage was judged, and most importantly, the psychological profile of their opponent. "Arrogance is the weapon we will use against him," Alex stated one night, his finger tracing a line on a crudely drawn map of the trial route. "He doesn't just want to win. He needs to win in a way that utterly humiliates you and validates his entire worldview. He needs to prove that your strength is a sham and that I am a pathetic weakness." Listened, her initial skepticism having long since transformed into rapt attention, as he laid out the framework of a plan that was as audacious as it was unorthodox. Their strategy would hinge on weaponizing's perception of Alex as a fragile burden. In the test of strength, they would concede, would perform well enough to satisfy honor, but they would allow a clear and early victory, feeding his ego and making him believe the trial was already his. The true battle would begin in the sky race, a stage where Alex was supposed to be a helpless passenger. Instead, he would become a navigator and a saboteur, using his small size and knowledge of the terrain, gleaned from days of studying maps, to guide her through treacherous shortcuts and to trigger small, calculated rock slides to impede path, all under the guise of clumsy terror. The final combat, Alex argued, was not about him fighting at all. His role was to be the perfect distraction, to use obsessive contempt for him as a tool to draw the warrior's focus, to make him angry and reckless, creating the openings that, with her superior skill, could exploit for a decisive victory. It was a plan that required perfect timing, absolute trust, and a shared understanding that went beyond words. It was a strategy where his mind and her might were not separate assets, but two halves of a single, interlocking weapon. In the long hours of planning and arguing, of challenging and refining, they ceased to be a warrior and her ward and became a true and seamless team, their every thought bent toward their shared survival. On the night before the trial, a profound and heavy stillness settled over the fortress. Their preparations were complete, every contingency planned for, every possible outcome debated. There was nothing left to do but wait for the dawn. They sat in her chambers, the torches burning low, the silence between them no longer a space of tension or negotiation, but of shared, unspoken dread. Alex was cleaning the ceremonial blade he had so disastrously gifted her, polishing the shimmering alloy until it shone, the simple, repetitive task a balm for his frayed nerves. Watched him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "I am afraid," she said suddenly, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the distant howl of the wind. He looked up, surprised by the raw admission. He had never seen her as afraid of anything. "The trial doesn't frighten me," she continued, her ruby gaze fixed on him, raw and vulnerable. "Losing my title, my territory, that is a wound I can survive. I have survived worse." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "But he will try to kill you, Alex. He will not be satisfied with just winning. He will make an example of you to prove his point. And I am afraid," her voice cracked, "that I will not be able to stop him." The confession was a devastating blow, a stripping away of her final piece of armor, and in that moment he saw not the champion or the politician, but only a woman terrified of losing someone she had come to care for. He set the blade down and went to her, kneeling before her where she sat and took her hand in his. Her skin was warm, her grip strong even in her distress. "What started as a role for me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that surprised him with its intensity. "A part I was playing to survive, it stopped being that a long time ago. In the cave during the storm, I don't know when, but I am not fighting for a treaty tomorrow, and I am not just fighting for my own life. I am fighting for you." The unspoken truth that had been growing between them, nurtured in the fires of shared danger and whispered confessions, was finally laid bare. It was not a relationship born of political convenience, but a bond forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. He leaned in and gently rested his forehead against hers, a simple, profound gesture of intimacy that transcended the boundaries of their species. They stayed like that for a long time, two disparate souls from different worlds, united by a single purpose, ready to face the dawn and a trial that would either cement their bond for eternity or shatter them into oblivion. The dawn broke not with light, but with a deeper shade of purple, the nascent storm on the horizon painting the jagged peaks in hues of violet and blood. The ascent to the pinnacle of judgment was a silent, grim procession, a climb into the very teeth of the wind, with the entire clan watching from lower, more sheltered ledges, their forms small and distant against the immense scale of the mountain. The pinnacle itself was a windswept, flattened speartip of rock scoured clean by storms, a natural arena where the sky itself was the only spectator that truly mattered. Here, there was no room for political maneuvering, no space for anything but raw strength, primal skill, and the desperate, calculated cunning of their plan. Was already there, a silhouette of arrogant power against the churning clouds, his victory already so certain in his mind that his posture was one of bored impatience. He looked at Alex with an expression of profound disgust, as if his mere presence on this sacred ground was a blasphemy that must be cleansed. The matriarch's voice, carried on the wind by some ancient acoustic property of the rocks, declared the commencement of the trial, her words a final, inescapable sentence. The first stage, the test of strength, began immediately, a simple, brutal affair involving the lifting and hurling of massive, roughly hewn judgment stones, each weighing more than Alex himself. It was a test designed for physiology, and it was here that their strategy of calculated defeat was put into motion. Approached her stone, her movements fluid and powerful, and with a controlled grunt of exertion, she lifted it and sent it sailing over the cliff edge, a respectable but far from record-breaking throw. Then it was turn. He sneered, cracked his knuckles, and hefted his own stone as if it were a mere pebble, his muscles bunching into cords of indigo steel. He roared, a sound of pure ego, and launched his stone with such ferocious power that it seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before plunging into the abyss, easily surpassing Smark by a dozen lengths. A murmur of disappointment went through the distant crowd and basked in it, his chest puffed out with pride. He had his victory, his public validation, and as he shot a triumphant, mocking glare at, he completely missed the subtle, almost imperceptible exchange of glances between her and Alex, a silent confirmation that the first piece of their desperate gambit had fallen perfectly into place. The second stage, the sky race, began with a blast from a ceremonial horn, its mournful cry swallowed by the rising wind. Crouched, pulling Alex tightly against her chest with his good arm wrapped securely around her neck, and launched them from the pinnacle into the heart of the storm. The wind was a solid, battering wall, and for a terrifying moment they plunged downwards before her powerful wings caught a violent updraft, sending them soaring into the maelstrom. Was a demon in his element, his flight path a direct and brutal assault on the wind, his raw strength allowing him to power through the gusts that threatened to tear them apart. He quickly pulled ahead, a dark shape against the electric purple clouds, confident that, burdened by her human cargo, stood no chance of catching him. But he was flying the traditional race path, the one every warrior knew, a route that was safe and predictable. Alex, his face pressed against shoulder to shield it from the biting, rain-lashed wind, began to speak, his voice a shouted guide against the storm's roar. Left, into the crevice, the one we marked as the Serpent's Tooth. Following his direction, banked sharply, diving into a narrow, winding canyon that was not part of the official route, a treacherous shortcut known only to those who had studied the mountain's ancient geology. They were flying on faith, trusting in the maps Alex had memorized, her power and his knowledge becoming a single, symbiotic entity. The canyon was a claustrophobic nightmare of twisting rock and violent, unpredictable crosswinds, but it shielded them from the main force of the storm and cut nearly a third of the distance from their journey. They burst from the other side of the canyon just as was rounding the final turn of the traditional route, his momentary confusion at their sudden appearance turning to rage as he realized he had been outmaneuvered. He let out a furious roar and pumped his wings, his superior speed quickly closing the distance between them. This was the moment Alex had been waiting for, the fulcrum upon which their entire strategy pivoted. As drew perilously close behind them, preparing to surge past, Alex, feigning a spasm of terror, kicked out with his leg, his boot striking a section of loose, weathered rock on the cliff face beside them. It was a small, seemingly insignificant action, but it was enough. A cascade of scree and stone tumbled down into the flight path, a minor but perfectly timed rock slide. It was not enough to truly harm, but it forced him into a sharp, evasive dive to avoid the debris, a maneuver that cost him his momentum and precious seconds of flight time. As he recovered, let out a triumphant cry and beat her wings with a final, desperate burst of power, crossing the invisible finish line back at the pinnacle, a full 2 wing lengths ahead of her furious, sputtering rival. The distant clan, witnessing the impossible victory, let out a collective roar of shock and admiration. They had won the second stage, and in doing so, they had transformed arrogant confidence into a volatile, unstable fury. The final stage, combat on the pinnacle, began with no ceremony, only the raw, palpable hatred radiating from as he drew his wicked, serrated blade. The wind howled around them, a fitting soundtrack for the final, desperate act of their drama. The fight was a whirlwind of motion, its attacks all brute force and rage, its defense a masterpiece of controlled economic movement. She was the superior fighter, her skill and grace undeniable, but she was hampered by the constant, pressing need to keep herself between her opponent and Alex, who stood behind her near the center of the pinnacle. His mind clouded by the humiliation of the sky race, fought with a reckless fury, his every blow aimed at overwhelming her defenses. He saw Alex not as a spectator, but as the architect of his dishonor, and his obsession grew with every strike. Then he saw what he perceived as an opening. Forced to sidestep a particularly vicious lunge, left a clear, direct path to the human behind her. For in that moment the trial was no longer about defeating, it was about eradicating the source of his humiliation. With a bellow of pure, unadulterated rage, he abandoned his fight with the champion and launched himself in a blind, furious charge directly at Alex, his blade raised high for a killing blow. This was it. This was the moment their entire strategy had been built upon, the final, desperate gamble. Alex did not flinch, did not cry out, did not even try to run. He simply held his ground, his gaze locked on the charging warrior, a silent and defiant anchor in the storm. His universe had narrowed to a single point, the destruction of the weak, wingless creature before him. He was completely, utterly committed to his attack, his flank exposed, his balance overextended, his focus absolute. And in that moment of fatal obsession, moved. She was not a defender anymore, but a blur of avenging motion. She spun, her own blade not meeting his, but striking the flat of his weapon with a precise, calculated blow that sent it spinning from his grasp and over the cliff edge. Simultaneously, she swept her leg out, hooking his ankle, and with his forward momentum completely unchecked, crashed to the stone platform with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. Before he could even register what had happened, was upon him, her knee planted firmly in the center of his back, the tip of her secondary dagger pressed against the nape of his neck. The fight was over. Silence descended upon the pinnacle, a silence more profound than the howling of the wind. Lay defeated, his power broken, his honor shattered. The entire clan, watching from below, waited for the final, expected blow, the thrust that would end his life and Seal's victory. But it never came. With a final look of cold contempt, removed her blade from his neck, rose to her feet, and simply turned her back on her defeated rival, a gesture of dismissal more profound and humiliating than any execution. The roar that rose from the watching clan was a tidal wave of sound, a validation of not just her strength, but her wisdom and mercy. As was led away by the matriarch's guard, his face a mask of disbelief and utter ruin, walked to where Alex stood, his body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. She reached out, her hand gently touching the side of his face, a public gesture of such tenderness and intimacy that it silenced the cheering crowd. She then turned to face her people, her voice ringing out over the pinnacle, carried by the wind for all to hear. "You have witnessed the trial," she boomed, her voice resonating with a power and confidence that was absolute. "But you have witnessed it through the lens of old laws and old titles. Called this man my pet, a thing to be owned, a symbol of weakness." She pulled Alex to her side, her arm wrapping around his shoulders, a gesture of partnership, of equality. He was wrong. What began as a strategy to protect my clan from division has revealed a truth I did not expect. This man is no one's property. He possesses a courage that is not of the wing and a strength that is not of the muscle. He stood on this pinnacle facing death without flinching, not for a treaty, not for his own life, but for the sake of my honor and for me. She looked down at Alex, her ruby eyes blazing with an emotion that was fierce and undeniable, an emotion that had been forged in conspiracy, tempered in danger, and was now refined into something pure and unbreakable. "He is not my pet," she declared, her voice ringing with the force of a sacred vow. "He is my mate. What began as a lie before the clan is now the truth of my heart." Alex, no longer the nervous diplomat but a man who had found his place in this storm-racked world, met her gaze and smiled. In front of her entire civilization, under the bruised and churning sky of, he sealed not only the treaty between their peoples, but a bond that had been born of a calamitous misunderstanding, and had blossomed into a powerful, undeniable love, a true alliance that would forever unite their two worlds. The storm was breaking, and for the first time, the light of sun was beginning to shine through the clouds.